It's an honor to be introducing my friend and colleague Royal Skousen tonight, and I really mean that. I'm not just being polite or ceremonial. It's an honor because, as interesting and valuable as the previous two lectures in this series have been, this one strikes me as the most significant of the three. The central task of the Book of Mormon Critical Text Project has always been, to the extent possible, to restore the original English text of the Book of Mormon by scholarly means. It's an honor because I regard this project as one of the most impressive scholarly efforts in the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, one that isn't likely ever to be displaced from that position. Professor Skousen has been the editor, the leader of the project since its inception in 1988, which is to say that he's devoted a quarter of a century to the effort. In terms of sheer, sustained dedication, the project is in a class by itself. In 2001, 13 years into his work, he began to publish the results of his research in multiple massive volumes brought out by the Foundation for Ancient Research and Mormon Studies, or FARMS. In 2009, Yale University Press published his edition of the Book of Mormon, the earliest text, a wonderful contribution that I would love to see in the home of every English-reading Latter-day Saint. And the work continues. I hope that I'm not violating a confidence in passing on a comment that Professor Skousen made to me not long ago. Everything he's studied, every interest he's had, all of his training and background, he says, equipped him to carry out this project. And his background and areas of expertise are impressive. He received his PhD in linguistics from the University of Illinois in 1972. He's taught there, at the University of California at San Diego, at the University of Texas at Austin, and as a Fulbright lecturer at the University of Tampere in Finland. In 2001, he was a fellow of the Max Planck Institute in the Netherlands. He's pursued his interests in linguistic theory and quantum computing with very fruitful results, including the volumes Analogical Modeling of Language, 1989, Analogy and Structure, 1992, and Analogical Modeling, an Exemplar-Based Approach to Language, 2002. Perhaps most important of all, he married Sirku, who has been his indispensable support, assistant, and advisor throughout the history of the Book of Mormon Critical Text Project. There are numerous other assets that he's brought to the project, attributes that in my judgment have been essential to its remarkable success. I believe that they can most usefully be summed up as constituting a remarkable, even fierce, intellectual integrity. His work is meticulous, precise. He's the consummate scholarly craftsman. He won't fudge, won't distort to satisfy anybody or to advance an agenda. He won't tolerate sloppiness, and obviously will not rush to quick publication. He gives intense and painstaking care to even the physical appearance, external and internal, of the project's publications, and he's had vital support in this from the inimitable and irreplaceable Jonathan Saltzman. Reflecting this fierce intellectual integrity has been his adamantine insistence on the independence of the project. Although he's a deeply believing Latter-day Saint, he has maintained successfully and from its very beginning that the project must be run according to the most rigorous academic principles, without distorting allegiance to any particular party, sect, or ideology, that it be independent even of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Only thus can it have the credibility that it must have if it's ultimately to be worthy of the keystone of our religion. In this respect, I confess that Professor Skousen reminds me just a bit of Juanita Brooks, a faithful believer whose lifelong research, I thought that would get a laugh, whose lifelong research into the Mountain Meadows massacre irritated and alienated many of her fellow members of the church, including some of her leaders, but whose value not only to historical scholarship but to the kingdom has now, I think, long since been generally recognized. Nothing but the truth, she famously said, is good enough for the church to which I belong. An anecdote. Dr. Skousen has been a legendarily tough negotiator on behalf of the project, even with leaders of the university and the church. At one point, during the entirely separate talks that brought farms into the university, I announced to then President Merrill J. Bateman that we decided to appoint Royal Skousen as our representative in those negotiations from that point on. For a moment, he seemed speechless with shock. Then when he realized that I was joking, he laughed loudly. He, too, had plainly come to respect Professor Skousen's tenacity and principle. The Book of Mormon Critical Text Project has already made an enormous contribution, and the gift keeps on giving. Without it, we would still be at the mercy of critics shouting about the number of changes made to the Book of Mormon text after its first printing. They've considerably underestimated that number, by the way. and claiming both that our failure to acknowledge those changes demonstrates a cover-up, and that the sheer fact of the changes proves Joseph Smith a false prophet. We now know far more than they ever bothered to learn about the nature of those changes, and we know that the changes are anything but faith-destroying. Professor Skousen has been able to demonstrate the impressively systematic nature of the original text, as he terms it, which subsequent emendations and corrections have tended to obscure. Without Dr. Skousen's work, we would not have his powerful argument for the nature of the translation, which he believes to have been read off word for word to Joseph's scribes. We wouldn't be aware of the presence of seemingly archaic language in the original text, not Joseph Smith's early 19th century American dialect, and shockingly, not even the language of the King James Version, but terms and expressions from a generation or two earlier. If Professor Skousen's perceptions are accurate, this will be surprising to believers, but I think utterly confounding to skeptics, who insist that the Book of Mormon can be exhaustively explained on the basis of Joseph's own natural information horizon. Without Dr. Skousen's labors, we would be unaware of some of the most persuasive Hebraisms in the text, the if-and conditional sentences in Helaman and Moroni, which seem to me exceedingly difficult to explain on a naturalistic model of the book's origins. We wouldn't know of the 256 places where changes could justifiably be made to the text that, while leaving the doctrines intact, would affect meaning and translation. We wouldn't have the powerful evidence that his work has supplied, demonstrating that Joseph really was encountering the text for the first time, just as the church has always taught, and that the original manuscript really was orally dictated. Above and beyond its intrinsic scholarly merits, the Book of Mormon Critical Text Project is a work of pure disinterested scholarship of the highest order. Royal Skousen's 25 years of intensive labor have, in the Book of Mormon's own language, made weak things become strong unto us. This is my favorite kind of apologetics. It not only takes a weapon away from our critics, but transforms it into a weapon to be wielded effectively in defense of the kingdom. I repeat, it's a great personal honor for me to have this opportunity to introduce Professor Royal Skousen.
So tonight we're going to be talking about the nature of the original text, and there are three parts. I'm going to go back again to the original manuscript, and we'll talk about that and its very significant importance. Then I'm going to turn to a subject which has been of some controversy for some, and this is the role of conjectural emendations in the Book of Mormon text. And finally, then we will turn to what is the nature of the original language, English language, I might point out, the English language text of the Book of Mormon. Next. So the first thing we have to understand is the overall nature of the kinds of differences we are finding in the text. And the raw numbers are not always helpful, but you have to distinguish between what is being considered. So in volume 4 of the critical text, these are the maroon books that are up here. There are 6 of them. I consider 5,280 cases of variation in the text, places where there is variation or potential variation. These are the cases of conjecture. And I've examined those in there and detailed analyses of each of those. When everything is done and you look at those particular examination of variance, we end up with 2,241 differences in the Yale edition from the standard text. Now, the vast majority of these are, most people would think, rather minor, and I think that's right. And they wouldn't show up in translation. But what is really, first of all, important to realize is there are a number of changes that depend solely upon readings that we haven't seen before, that have not appeared in either the LDS or the RLDS scriptures. There are 606 of these. And if you look at the numbers, you'll see that there are 216 from the original manuscript alone. This means that when it was copied into the printer's manuscript, a change was made. And we only have 28% of the original manuscript. There are 88 changes that come from a reading that is in both the original and the printer's manuscript. This means the change was made by the typesetter, the 1830 typesetter. Now, a lot of those have already been discovered. This is worth pointing out because we've had the printer's manuscript. There are other ones, these 88, there are 88 that have never been put into an edition. There are 2 changes based on the fact that the title page was multiply copied. We wish we had more copies of the original. We only have basically one, the printer's manuscript. For 1/6 of the text, we have 2 copies. The 1830 was set from the original manuscript from Helaman 13 through the end of Mormon. And they made the printer's copy too. So there are 2 copies there. We wish they had made more copies because we have lost most of the original. 28% is left. Joseph Smith put it in the cornerstone of the Nauvoo house, as we described in the first lecture, and mold and water destroyed most of it. So anyway, the title page, we have multiple copies, and we can discover that Oliver made a couple of errors when he copied from the original, which we don't have for the title page, into the printers, because all the other copies agree, and they're not being copied from each other either. They're independent copies. There are 187 changes that have not appeared in any printed edition that come from the printers alone. These are cases where we don't have the original. But this is the 1830 typesetter making the mistake for the most part. And then there's 113 conjectural emendations, which I propose and others have proposed, which I have accepted, that are discussed in the 6 volumes. And we're going to talk about this tonight because some people have the mistaken notion that conjectures are a rare thing and never really occur in textual criticism. And this is, I think, a mistake to have this assumption. Okay, the next one. This is one I showed on the first lecture, but I want to repeat it to show the importance of the original manuscript, and we really wish we had all of it. Of the 6 volumes, these represent, like 1 Nephi 1 to 2 Nephi 10 represents the first book here, and these are the 6 books. And for the ones marked with an asterisk, we have good portions of the original manuscript. For the first and 4th ones, we have 75%, more or less, of the original. For the 5th one, we have about 25% of the original. For the other 3, the 2nd, 3rd, and the 6th, we have hardly anything, just little portions. And when you look over here, we can see the new readings. These are the new readings that the 606 total we're talking about. Original manuscript, there are 95 here, 93 here, 25 here. It's in proportion to how much we have of the original. So what this means, and you can look here, these are both, and there's some with P alone because we don't have O. But what this means is that if we sort of calculate, if we had the original, there should be about 280 additional changes. And it's very difficult to guess these by conjecture. When these were discovered, the one like here, 95, 93, 25, I was almost always surprised. No one had ever conjectured them. When you saw the reading, though, you said, oh yeah, this actually works in fact, it works better in many instances, and very often more consistent with the text. But it had to be triggered by the actual reading. And so that's something to really keep in mind. When the Yale edition came out, or one of the issues with Yale itself and with the church was whether the subtitle for this book should be the Book of Mormon, the title, and then the original text. And I was considering using the term original text because textual critics always do this. Whatever we come up with, that is the original text. And Yale was a little concerned about it, and the church was, as I mentioned, because we can't really be sure. And in many respects, there are at least, I think, 280 changes that if we knew them, we'd say, oh, yes, this is really good that we would know these. So there is a sense in which the earliest text is a little more neutral, but it still includes the possibility of conjectures, as we shall see. Okay, next. Now, this is an important reading, a number. It's 241 readings, new readings, that will make a difference in translation. That if you're translating the Book of Mormon into another language, this will be a change in a word. There are 241 of them, and this is one example from 1 Nephi 12 and 18. And a great and a terrible gulf divideth them, yea, even the sword of the justice of the eternal God. The word is sword. But Oliver misread it. It was by one of the Whitmers who had written it in the original, and it was miscopied by him as word. And I don't know of any language where the word for sword is the same as word. So it'll show up in translation. Now, what you find with this, though, is, and no one ever conjectured this, as far as I know, and actually it was staring everyone in the face. That is, we had the original and people had read it, and I misread it myself as word because of the way it was written by the scribe. Okay, the next one shows, though, that if we look at the whole text, we find that there are only references to the sword of the justice of God. There are no examples in the text of the word of the justice of God. This is what I mean, that when you finally see the reading, you say, oh yeah, and this is consistent with the text. It makes the text, I suppose, a little more violent. You know, maybe we don't like the idea that justice is like a sword, but the rest of the text is supporting this. And we could always say, yes, well, God's justice is his word. He will declare it. He will say something. So you wouldn't automatically think there was something wrong with that. And that's what I mean when I say there's probably 280 more of these out there. Okay, next. Some people have asked me, do we ever find ones that change the doctrine? And the answer is no. There have been none that have changed the doctrine, but there have been a few which restore the correct teachings and the doctrine. And they're not done in a way that is, really overwhelmingly, obvious. But this is an example of what Alma 39:13 originally read, but rather return unto them and acknowledge your faults and repair that wrong which ye have done. This is Alma speaking to Corianton, the wayward missionary. He's supposed to go back to the Zoramites and acknowledge his faults and repair. He's supposed to do something besides just saying, hey, I'm sorry. And what happened on this particular page in the original manuscript is that when Oliver got done writing it, he dropped ink. Little ink drops are all over this page. And they're going every which way and so forth, except on the word repair. The P has an ascender, not in type, but in writing it goes up. And one of those drops of ink just fell right on top of the ascender, like it was crossed. So now it looks sort of like a T. And for Oliver, he writes R's at the end, and he brings the R down so it looks like an N very often. Once the typesetter set Gadianton the robber as Gadianton the nobler. It's one of the best readings in the 1830 because he misread Oliver's R as an N. And Oliver himself misread this one. Once the big heavy ink glob, looks like a heavy crossing of the P, is there, and he reads it as retain. So he put in and retain that wrong which ye have done. And it sat there in the Book of Mormon till the 1920 edition. And then Brother Talmage and the committee, said, this retain, what does this mean? Do you keep the sin, or there's a meaning of retain in the Book of Mormon that is bring it back, take it back. So your sin is out there. Maybe you could think of it as bringing back the sin. But this is not really necessary, but they looked at it and couldn't figure out why it was retain. And so they removed it. And that's okay, but now look what it says. It says, acknowledge your faults and that wrong which you have done. It's removed reparation as part of the process that he's supposed to be involved in. It isn't, now, restoring repair then means that the full notion of repentance appears in this statement instead of just part of it. So it doesn't change any doctrine, but it's reaffirming the true doctrine that we know. And the next one is a nice one, I think, a quote from another part of the Book of Mormon. You can get support for this. So we have these converts, they confess their sins, they're baptized unto repentance, immediately return to the Nephites to endeavor to repair unto them the wrongs which they had done. So there's the very same phraseology. But again, probably none of us have ever noticed there was something wrong with the current reading. And this is the kind of thing I'm talking about, that we've got these in the text, probably other places that we're not really aware of. Okay, next. There are some Book of Mormon names that are changed. There are two of them that I think are interesting. The others are just changing letters. They're different. The one that I think is interesting is the name of the last son of Zedekiah who survives is not Mulek, but Moloch, M-U-L-O-C-H, which is a rather ominous name because it suggests the pagan god Moloch or Molech that they sacrifice children to. Name your kid after one of these gods, you might get protection. And there are examples of both Jonathan in the Bible and naming children with Baal, a secondary name with Baal, using a pagan god in the name. So it's an interesting aspect. It might be difficult for us to get used to the Molochites, but that's what the text actually supports. Why is it, though, changed to Mulek? It's because later in the text, twice, right here, when it refers to this same individual, in the intervening moments, there had been the city Mulek, and there were 12 times in Alma 51 and once in Alma 5. So when they came to Helaman 5, and when they came to Helaman 6, and they're apparently just saying Mulek for Moloch, and so Oliver just writes it Mulek. He doesn't ask Joseph, how do you spell that? And so we ended up with 3 occurrences of Mulek, and so eventually Orson Pratt decides the first one ought to be Mulek too, make it consistent. And so we end up having the name changed. Okay, that's one of them. The other one, next one, well, I guess we'll come to that later. Okay, so here are some other names that Oliver changed. In these cases, we actually have the original, and for some reason, he changes names. Oliver's an independent guy, and he will make changes as he copies. And this one is probably accidental, Zenic. He first wrote it in the original with CA, or actually CK, and because Zenic, he heard that, and he spells it CK, and then he crossed it out. We showed this earlier, and it was done with CH. He corrects it in line, but the problem was when he came to copying this into the printers, he reinstated all his CKs. He just really forgot. His first occurrence was with CK, so he just ends up changing the name. The other ones are also ones that we have the earliest occurrence for these two, the second, and some other ones that support this, double D, a C. He just changes them. Now, but these are examples that you could say, well, we're not worried about these. Unless you're interested in the study of names and what they might mean and so forth, that would be of interest. Okay, the next one. John Gilbert makes a few changes. You will notice his are less significant, not as frequent names. And one of them is the monetary units, which he changes from shillim to shiblum, because the following monetary unit is shiblon, and the BL in that influenced him to change this one. So that was accidental. I don't, who knows what's going on, but they just made the typesetter made these changes. Okay, the next one. Well, this is the other change, Amalekites. If we read in the book of Alma, we have the Amalekites in Alma chapter 2 and 3. And then when you come to chapter 21 of Alma, it suddenly starts talking about Amalekites. And you think, what's this group? Who are they? But it turns out when we look at the original manuscript here, 3 occurrences, it's almost Amalekites. It's just got an extra in it. And what Oliver did here was he just looked at this and substituted a Bible name for a group, the Amalekites. And so from Alma 21 on, we have Amalekites as the apostate group. So you think there are 2 of them, but there's really only one. It's coming from Amalekite. Okay. Now, let's talk about conjectural emendations. Some people think you should never make conjectural emendations. Well, not only do they occur all the time, sometimes you have to make them. And here is an example that you have to make. We have the original manuscript for 1 Nephi 7 and 5. It reads, "The Lord did soften the heart of Ishmael and also his whole." This is what probably Christian Whitmer, one of the Whitmers, wrote originally. This means originally. He corrected it by inserting another whole in there, in front of it. And maybe this should be W-H-O-L-E, his whole. Now, that's what the text reads. It can't be right. I would not like to see a Book of Mormon reading that way. You soften the heart of Ishmael and also his whole, wherever it is. So we know there's something wrong here. Now, Oliver Cowdery then made a conjecture. When he copied it, he tried to guess what he thought it should be. That's a conjecture. A conjecture is when you come up with another reading that isn't supported by what you already have, whether it's another edition of the Book of Mormon or whether it is a manuscript. If you come up with your own, it's a conjecture. So that's what Oliver did. This is the printer's manuscript. He thought it meant household. I think it's a pretty good guess. But I believe it's whole household. And there are 2 reasons for it. First of all, there are 2 wholes in here. And this is closer to being 2 wholes, a whole household, where the D very often is lost in speech. The other one is internal evidence. The next slide will show that if you look at the whole Book of Mormon, wherever it refers to a patriarch, it is the patriarch and his whole household or all his household. It's what we call a universal quantifier. It's not a modern day household. Everybody goes along. And so, and you even have the one in Alma 22, which has the same language. So, and if you look at, Ishmael went out, some of his sons, didn't want to be there. You discover this pretty soon, but they still went. So whole household fits in with the narrative, with the rest of the text, and explains the two wholes. But the real point here is either I or Oliver Cowdery or somebody else with another conjecture has got to make a conjecture. There will be a conjecture here. Your text of the Book of Mormon has household, that is yours, meaning ours. The LDS one has a conjecture. And the Yale edition has a conjecture. There will be conjectures. Okay, next. So, if you look at the standard text, which is the current LDS text, there are 654 conjectured readings in it. That's pretty surprising. But what that means is that as you go along in the transmission of the text, a copyist, a typesetter, an editor sees something and they don't like it. And there's something usually difficult or strange about what they're looking at, and they decide to change it to something that isn't in another edition or in another manuscript or something. They come up with it. That's a conjecture. And in our current text, we have 654 of these. In the Yale edition, there are almost a little bit more than half that, 354, and they're not always the same, but there are fewer conjectures in the Yale. The reason for them being fewer is that many times a change was made because someone saw a difficult reading, but it really wasn't that difficult. You could live with it, but they preferred something that would flow more easily for the reader. We'll see some examples here. In the 6 books, Volume 4, I considered 1,346 cases of conjectural emendation. That means I considered myself and suggestions from people, cases where there isn't textual support, that we're coming up with another reading. And I ended up accepting about 1 out of 4, 26%. And this, you'll see, is a pretty good mark of what's involved in this. It is worth pointing out, I said there were 113 that were new to the Yale. There are 187 that are common with our current text and the Yale edition. So there is an overlap. It isn't they're all different. 187 of them agree. Okay, next. Well, we're going to look at some of these. And I'm going to take some of the more prominent individuals who made conjectural emendations and look at one where we accept it and one where we reject it. At least I rejected it. So in our current text, there are 131 conjectures that come from Oliver Cowdery. And these will be ones that either made in the original, correcting something that someone else had written, or he corrected it in the printer's manuscript as he copied. There are 120 of those that are in the current text, so we've eliminated 11 of them, decided we didn't like them. There are 39 of those in the Yale edition, ends up being 30% are accepted. And this a little bit higher than 1 out of 4, so Oliver's actually doing pretty good. 1 Nephi 7:1 is an example which is accepted. It talks about that his son should take daughters to wife that might raise up seed. And that's the original reading. And Oliver, when he copied it, put in the pronoun they, the subject, because he felt like the sons with the daughters would be raising up seed. And this, I think, is correct. When we look at the rest of the Book of Mormon, when they talk about raising up seed, they don't mean rearing children. They don't mean changing diapers. We sometimes think this is, but what they mean is producing offspring. And every place in the Book of Mormon, it's both male and female that are raising up seed. This is the way the phrase is used in the text. So we have a scribe. This is one of the Whitmers, again, Christian probably. And we ask ourselves, does Christian Whitmer leave out subject pronouns? We want to see if there's really evidence for what we're doing. And we find, although there aren't examples of they, there are quite a few examples with I. He leaves out I very often. He's in a hurry, whatever he's doing, to write it down, and he will leave out subject pronouns. So this is not an impossible kind of thing. But given the rest of the text, it does seem right. And so the critical text has accepted this conjecture. This is a conjecture. Okay, next. This is one where Oliver's conjecture is rejected. So the original reads that it contained the fullness of the gospel of the land. Land. The gospel of the land. Now, you could probably work on it, and I think this is okay. But Oliver didn't think so. He made a conjecture. He changed it to Lord. It's even capitalized by this scribe. So he ends up doing Lord. In the critical text, I argue that it was probably lamb. The original is being dictated. You can mishear it. And so land, if you say the gospel of the lamb, you might hear lan without a D, you just hear a nasal, and thus misinterpret it. And I think that's what happened here. The scribe misinterpreted and thought it was land, wrote it. And if you look at the rest of the text, it talks about the gospel of the Lamb. It doesn't talk about the gospel of the Lord. There are no examples in the Book of Mormon of the gospel of the Lord. It makes sense, but it's not there. But the gospel of the Lamb is everywhere else. So this looks like a primitive mishearing, and we reject Oliver's suggested emendation. Okay, next. This is the typesetter. And he has a very high percentage, 47%. Not that he's inspired, but it's because he has dumb readings. Oliver is the scribe usually for the printers, and he'll sometimes write really dumb things. One time he wrote, the temporal baby. The printer's manuscript in one place reads the temporal baby. Now, it's supposed to be the temporal body. You can tell from the context. He typeset body. He gets credit for that. He gets credit. That's a conjecture, but it's pretty clear. Most of us, reading the passage, would say, oh, yes, Oliver is thinking of something else. Okay, so here's an example which we accept. That other one we accepted too. But whoso shall lay their hands upon me shall wither even as a dried weed. Original reads this way. And the printers is copied this way. But the typesetter thought, no, I think it's reed. And I think he's right. There are too many weeds in upstate New York, and not enough reeds for them to think of that. But scripturally, we have examples where brooks of defense shall be emptied and dried up, the reeds and flags shall wither. And it probably was reed, and Joseph probably, this is, again, it's being dictated. He says reed, but Oliver hears weed, and so that's what he wrote. And so we accept this conjecture. The next one. So in this one, the typesetter is looking at the printer's manuscript, and it says, yea, come unto me and bring forth works of righteousness, and ye shall not be put down. For modern English, to be put down, we would accept, but this is sort of a strange usage for those times. And the typesetter thought it should be, well, especially when you have it here in cast into the fire. And there's lots of Book of Mormon examples talking about people being hewn down and cast into the fire. So he substituted hewn for put. This is a conjecture. But I think it's cut. cut down and cast into the fire. The reason is this would be, we don't have the original here, but I think if we had it, we would see it was cut with a capital C. Very often the scribes wrote their C's with capitals, and they write it with a big loop, and so if you look at it fast, you're going to think it's put. And so that's where I think the error came. It would have been from going from the O to P. It's a visual error. And you can find scriptural reference, although the Book of Mormon doesn't actually have any examples of cut down and cast into the fire. It only has hewn down. But I think this is one where there would have been cut down. We do have other scriptures, Jeremiah, cut down thy choice cedars and cast them into the fire. The use of the other verb does exist scripturally. So I think that's my conjecture. Okay, the next. Joseph Smith. He will do two major edits, one for the second edition and another for the third. The second edition is massive. Most of the editing, though, is grammatical, changing whiches to who, and we talked about that in the last lecture. But he also does conjectures, and Joseph makes a lot of changes. And a lot of it is due to the fact that he wants to make the text read easier for people. And a lot of those changes aren't really necessary. You can deal with them, but he probably was right in trying to make it easier. So he makes a lot of them, and thus they are rejected in the critical text because they aren't necessary. And you can support the original. And so there only ends up being, turns out there are a lot of them in our current edition, 174, but only 16%, about 1 out of every 6. In the 1840 edition, he doesn't make as many of these, and only 2 of them, it's 11%. So it's quite low. But this is what happens when you have an editor who is really engaging in the text and wants to make it easier to read. Okay. Here's one that we accept. And never has man come before me with such exceeding faith as thou hast. For were it so, ye could not have seen my finger. Were it so. It's just bizarre. And Joseph put in, for were it not so. And I think this is correct. And we can find lots of evidence for not being accidentally omitted in the text. There's 5 or 6 other places where scribes at various points omitted not. So it's not something that's unusual. Now, one that is rejected and is a difficult one is King Benjamin. This is when Ammon has found these people, and the people of Zeniff, who have become the people of Noah, then became the people of Limhi. And he announces that he can't translate, but King Benjamin has a gift from God, he can translate. But we just read earlier in Mosiah, Benjamin after 3 years had died. So he's not supposed to be alive. Now there's actually probably a mix-up in the way the text is telling its story. And he was still alive. It's at the end of the 3rd year. And you can read the arguments there, and Hugh Nibley is one that believed that Benjamin should also be restored. But Joseph Smith did change it to Mosiah, who was the reigning king back then. And but this doesn't look like a kind of error that you would make from visual or from hearing. It really was Benjamin, and it was Benjamin. He was still alive, but he wasn't the reigning king. It's like the Pope. Okay. Now, we can look at other editions to look at conjectures. They all have them. They run across difficult things they want to deal with. And you can see here is the total number they made. Here's how many are in your current text. And here is what's in the Yale. Notice These are probably mostly Talmage, although there is a committee and you could diffuse the responsibility. But 130, 129 are in our current text because we haven't changed much really from the 1920. But only 22, 17%. This is down at the Joseph Smith level because Talmage is an editor that wants you to have an easier read, and so he will make lots of conjectures. But they're not really necessary, even though they make the text a little difficult. Okay, next. These are scriptural scholars that came up with conjectures prior to the Critical Text Project. And they have a pretty good number. They usually didn't do too many, although Stan Larson and John Tvedtnes are two important individuals who provided conjectures. Tvedtnes for the Isaiah portions, and Stan Larson did work prior to the 1981. And some of them then are accepted in the Yale edition, and some are not. It's about half are accepted. The next one, well, there's me. So I thought of 401. And, I wasn't always serious, but I'd see one and say, well, maybe this is this. I'm going to go through and try and see what it is. And I ended up with 26%. Rejecting, I accepted 103. And you can read them all and you can see if I'm out of bounds or not. They're in the book. It's on record. So this was the most interesting. As part of this project, farms sent out to all their email subscribers a request for emendations in the text. Something to the effect, if you have any suggestions for emendations in the text, would you please send them to Royal Skousen, gave my email. For the first 48 hours, I thought I'd made a big mistake. I was inundated with emails of three types. Brother Skousen, we would like to help you, but would you please tell us what an emendation is? So, okay, I answered. I told them, it was a change in the text. But I also got things like, I thought the brethren cleaned all this up in the 1981 edition. There's nothing to change. It's all been done. And the other one is a little more serious one, why are you asking us? The brethren can get it revealed to them. And so, it was sort of this issue of whose responsibility and should average members be doing this kind of thing. But fortunately, there were individuals who took the request seriously. And I might point out that the independence of this project made it so I could send out such an email. Just think about a suggestion in the Ensign to send in your suggestions to the brethren on how to change the text. It is a difficult, tender situation, and I can do it, and I'll have to take the guff for not explaining what an emendation is. But so 42 individuals over the period of this sent in suggestions. 173 of them, that is particular, and sometimes they just says, I think something's weird here. Would you look at it? And sometimes I found things, 36, 21%. That means there's some really valuable readings in the Yale edition that are based on people sending in these. And there were 8 people that seemed, as they did it, to have gone through the whole text. They did it as a labor of love and of interest and fed me suggestions all along. Ross Geddes, who is now deceased in Australia, was particularly helpful. He has 8 changes that are dependent upon him. And one individual on here, I won't mention who he is, but he is dyslexic. And because he's dyslexic, for him to read the text, he sees things we normal readers don't see. And he had a number of really valuable, and some of those are there. One thing that's valuable is these are not known. I think now some of these people, David has and Heather, have published, are publishing scholars, but at the time where you would identify them as sort of lay members of the church who were interested in the text. There's some advantage to this. I didn't actually get really anything from religion faculty. There's a reason. They are used to taking whatever they have there and figuring it out. But these people are reading the text and saying, whoa, I don't understand this. And there is an advantage to having the sort of naive attempt to just understand the text. And I'm grateful that we did this. And it made this whole project much more public. When someone would suggest a change, I always made the analysis and sent it back to them. I wanted them to know that I valued it and that maybe I didn't accept it. I always invited them to send more, but sometimes, they had a suggestion which I thought was valuable. And the church can't do this either. If you send a suggestion to the Church Scriptures Committee, they will thank you and thank you. They can't do what I did. And so I think, Dan referred to the independence of this, but it has many important aspects that have freed the work on the text of the Book of Mormon in a way that couldn't be otherwise done. Okay, next. So now I come to an issue of, I'm going to start talking about the text itself, and my belief that this text was given to Joseph Smith through the instrument. He could see the actual words of English. He could see the names, even the Bible names. He could see them all. It was written out in Roman letters. And one of the evidences for this are constructions which are Hebrew-like. I'm going to say Hebrew-like, not Hebraisms, because I want to make a distinction here, but are Hebrew-like that show that Joseph Smith had to see these little unimportant words. If he were just getting ideas, he wouldn't have put these in because they're not in English. Now, you can find Hebraisms in the Book of Mormon that are also in the King James Bible. So you could say on those, well, Joseph, just knew his Bible really well. But these you're not going to find in the King James Bible because translators won't put them in. And the first one has to do with an extra and one example would be something like, if you come, and I will come. This is literal Hebrew. You have an extra and, what we would consider extra and, before that main clause. The Book of Mormon does not have these examples. What it has instead are cases where the subordinate clause is complex. It either adds an additional thing or has something parenthetical which breaks the flow. And almost every time, I won't say every, but almost every time the original text has an and. So it would be something like, if you come, and surely you should, and I will come. Now see, this is interruptive. Or you could have something like, if you come, and if your mother-in-law comes, if you added that, and I will come. These were in the original text, and they were not only with if, but with all other subordinate constructions. So we're going to see some. It isn't just if. Okay, so this is with as, and as I cast my eyes around about, and then there's the extra part, that perhaps I might discover my family also, and I beheld a river of water. That's the way the original text reads. That's the way the Yale text reads. We don't like this. This is not what we expect in English. It doesn't occur in dialects. It doesn't occur in the history of the language, but it's in the original text. And The "and" was removed, this time Oliver Cowdery. When he copied it into the printers, he just, it was one of those Whitmers. He probably said, oh, it's one of theirs. They goofed again. So he just took it out. Okay, well, he'll have some himself that he'll keep. So this is with because. And because he speaketh flattering words unto you, and he saith that all is well. See, there's the extra one. And then ye will not find no fault with him. Now you have to live with the multiple negative. That's okay. English has always had multiple negatives. Okay, next is when, and when Nephi had brought forth the records and laid them before him, there's that extra one, and laid them before him, and he cast his eyes upon them and saith, extra and. Mormon 3 and 4, and it came to pass that after this 10th year had passed away, making in the whole 360 years from the coming of Christ, and the king of the Lamanites sent an epistle unto me. Sometimes the typesetter is removing the ands. He just, at the end, the typesetter, he wasn't supposed to change the grammar, but I think he just decided at the end, these just aren't right. I'm taking them out. Next. This is while, and it came to pass that while he was journeying thither, being weighed down with sorrow, wading through much tribulation and anguish of soul, and there's actually more. Then it says, and it came to pass that while Alma was thus weighed down with sorrow, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared unto him, saying, this is pretty contorted syntax, but it's got the extra "and." And finally, one of the most famous verses in the Book of Mormon's got it. This is, and if you shall ask with a sincere heart, with real intent, having faith in Christ, there's the extra stuff, and he will manifest the truth of it unto you. Joseph Smith removed this one. Now you may say, okay, there's so many ands in the Book of Mormon, 16,000 or so by my count, there's something. They just made mistakes. They're just throwing in ands. Well, in the next one, it isn't just an accident. There's 7 of them in a row in Helaman 12, 13 through 21. And they're all there originally. And this is the first one, yea, and if he saith unto the earth, move. There's your interruptive element. And it is moved. The "and" was removed by Joseph Smith. He's going to edit these out because you are going to have trouble understanding the text. Next one. And this is the second one. Yea, if he say unto the earth, thou shalt go back, that it lengthen out the day for many hours, and it is done. And here's the last one. I skipped the other ones, but they're all in a row. Every "and" is there. So, what does this mean about Joseph Smith's translation? He is seeing the "and." He's being faithful to it, and he's dictating it. If he's getting ideas in his mind, it ought to be English with no "ands." But it isn't. It's something else. Now, it's not exactly Hebrew, because if you have short ones in the Book of Mormon, there are never any "ands." So we can't say it's exactly the same as Hebrew, but it is systematic and it is different. And to me, it shows he is seeing "ands," and he's faithfully reading them off. Okay. And there's even an inverted conditional clause. That sounds complicated. It's intended to. But we have these in English. And had they awoke the Lamanites, we would normally like "if" today, but had they awoke the Lamanites, behold, they were drunken. So there's your interruptive clause. And the Nephites could have slain them. There's that "and." And this one's never been removed. Occasionally they sneak through. It's good. Okay. Now, this one is one of the most controversial, and Dan referred to it. It's that there's vocabulary, words that we understand basically today, but they have different meanings. And the meanings can be found in English from the 15 and 1600s, but as far as we know, have died out. Now, some people claim that since they're in the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith wrote the Book of Mormon, these must be relics from upstate New York English. The burden of proof is on these people to go find them in upstate New York in the 1800s. because the Oxford English Dictionary and all the databases are showing that these meanings are gone from basically 1700. In fact, the Book of Mormon, as far as I know, doesn't have a word in it with a meaning that isn't at least 100 years old. Now you think about how you might be able to do a text, a religious text or any text, and avoid using any words or words that are already in English that have changed with meaning in the last 100 years. You wouldn't even know. You know, it's not like we have Oxford English dictionaries, you know, that we're carrying around in our brains. It's an archaic text. Now, you can find some of them, some of the meanings for these words in the King James Bible. There are some, but there's going to be, most of them are not. No. So this is one that is to cast, to shoot. The Lamanites could not cast their stones and their arrows at them. Cast their stones, we don't have a problem with that, but casting arrows. Now there are people that like to go out and find cases where Amerindians are throwing arrows like darts. But that's not really necessary when you discover that actually English from the 15 and 1600s used the verb cast with arrows to mean to shoot. And the Oxford English Dictionary gives this meaning and says that it was used, their citations date from 1300 to 1609. Now, they probably went longer. They weren't there when the last one died out. You know, it's going to go a little bit longer, but this is strange, to cast their arrows. But you can see it in the Bible. So you could say, Joseph Smith, he is a genius. He knows that Bible so well. He can imitate it. Now, I'm not a fan of that idea. I think Joseph is faithfully reading off a text, and it's pretty miraculous. We mustn't belittle this just because we think reading's easy. This is a different kind of text that he's reading. Okay, well, the next one. This will be in the King James. Okay, this is required. Enos. The Lord says to Enos, thy fathers have also required of me this thing. And we look at that and say, you know, Nephi and Lehi and Jacob were so faithful, they just forced the Lord to do it. They required it. However, in the Oxford English Dictionary, you will find citations from these periods where it means to request. And we can find a Bible one, for I was ashamed to require of the king a band of soldiers and horsemen to help us against the enemy in the way. They didn't want to request the king. Well, so this is another Bible example. The next one is an interesting one, because if you realize that you might be dealing with 15 and 1600 vocabulary, maybe some of the readings we give to a text should be rethought. So this one. So, and again, Alma commanded that the people of the church should impart of their substance, every one according to that which he hath. And if he have more abundantly, he should impart more abundantly. And he that hath but little should be required. Now, we can take that in our modern meaning of forced, the implication of forced, but maybe it just means requested, asked. Little was asked of those who didn't have much. It's something worth thinking about, that other words, this may apply to other words that we have traditionally thought of as more required. Okay. Wrapped. Wrapped originally, or at least during one of the definitions, 1350 to 1662, means to roll. Not to wrap up a pack, but roll it. And we have one that's pretty clear in the Book of Mormon that should be interpreted this way, and the earth should be wrapped together as a scroll. Scrolls are not wrapped up like Christmas gifts. You'll wreck them. So Elijah took his mantle and wrapped it together and smote the waters. The word in Hebrew is to roll it up. It's going to be sort of like a stick-like object. It isn't a little package, his coat. It isn't going to work if it's that interpretation. Okay, next. So, here are some that are not in the King James Bible. That were, and some of these have been removed from your text because they are difficult. So, but if, meaning unless, it was used from 1200 to 596, or at least the citations in the Oxford English Dictionary. For the natural man, this is a famous passage, for the natural man is an enemy to God and will be forever and ever, but if he yieldeth to the enticings of the Holy Spirit. And it means unless. And Talmage and the committee changed it to unless, removed but if. But we have examples. Here's one from Philip Sidney, 1580. He did not like that maids should once stir out of their father's houses, but if it were to milk a cow. A real tyrant. Okay, next. To commend, meaning to recommend someone to do something. They actually only, in the current, at least the second edition, the printed one, they only have one citation, 1647. But in Ether it says, and now I would commend you to seek this Jesus. Commend you. We would say recommend that you seek this Jesus. And here we have an example. It isn't in the King James Bible. Some friend shall commend the party inquiring to accept of some employment very advantageous. Recommend that they accept this. Okay. To counsel. The original text of the Book of Mormon has two examples of to counsel someone, meaning to counsel with. First one's nice. I mean, some of you may prefer this. Counsel the Lord in all thy doings. So just telling. But that isn't